There are at least 24 distinct voices living, rent-free, inside the average modern adult mind. None of them pay rent. All of them issue instructions. The viewer obeys most of them without ever noticing they have given the instruction. Because the voice has been speaking in the viewer's own voice, in the viewer's own name, for so long that the viewer cannot tell where the voice ends and the viewer begins. The checkpoint will now read all 24 of them out loud, each one identified by its typical sentence, its origin, its function, its disguise, its tax, and the one practice that lets the viewer hear the voice without obeying it. By the end of this video, the viewer will be able to identify out loud which two voices were speaking the last time the viewer woke up at 3 in the morning, convinced something was wrong. Before you do anything else, hear this. Before the first voice is named, one thing has to be said clearly. The voices in the viewer's mind are not the viewer. The checkpoint will repeat that. The voices in the viewer's mind are not the viewer. The viewer is the listener. The viewer is the room the voices live inside. The viewer is the one with the lease on the building. The voices have been speaking so long, so loudly in the viewer's own voice that the viewer has begun to mistake the voices for the listener. This is not the viewer's fault. This is the central confusion of an unwitnessed interior life. Checkpoint. Tectel will tell the viewer the deeper rule of this video. The viewer does not have to evict every voice. Some of them are useful. Some of them are old friends. Some of them were installed by people who loved the viewer. The viewer does have to charge them rent. Rent in this case is awareness, a voice that is identified, named, and listened to as a voice is paying rent. A voice that is mistaken for the viewer is living rent-free. 24 voices, each one given a name, each one charged rent. By the end of this video, the viewer's interior building will be in audit. Voice 1, the critic. Typical sentence, that was not good enough. You know that was not good enough. They could tell. Origin. A parent, teacher, coach, or early adult whose approval was conditional on performance, internalized so completely that the voice now arrives without the original speaker needing to be in the room. Function. Keeps the viewer striving by maintaining a permanent low-grade dissatisfaction with current output. Disguise. High standards. The critic frequently presents itself as the part of the viewer that cares about quality. This is a marketing claim. The critic does not actually care about quality. The critic cares about not being criticized first, which it accomplishes by criticizing the viewer preemptively. Tax. Most of the joy that would otherwise attach to the viewer's accomplishments. The critic confiscates the joy at the moment of the accomplishment and replaces it with the next standard. Practice. When the critic speaks, the viewer asks one question. Whose voice is this originally? The answer is almost never the viewer. The answer is usually a specific first name from the viewer's first 18 years. Voice 2, the rehearser. Typical sentence. Then they will say this, and you will say that, And then they will probably look at you like this, and then you will need to have already prepared an answer to that. Origin: an early environment in which spontaneous speech produced bad consequences, a household in which the wrong sentence triggered a fight, a classroom in which the wrong answer triggered humiliation. Function: protects the viewer from being caught unprepared in a future conversation. Disguise: being thoughtful. The rehearser likes to present itself as the part of the viewer that is responsible about communication. In reality, the rehearser is the part that is conducting imaginary conversations on a loop in order to avoid being surprised. Tax: an enormous quantity of present moment attention. The rehearser is almost always running. While the rehearser is running, the viewer is not actually in the room they are physically in. Practice: when the rehearser begins, the viewer says one sentence out loud. The actual conversation will be different than this. This sentence does not silence the rehearser. It puts the rehearser on notice that the listener has heard it and is choosing not to be hijacked by it. Voice 3. The comparer. Typical sentence: he is doing better than you. She is doing better than you. They are doing better than you. You are behind. Origin: any sibling environment with comparative parenting, any school system with public grades, any social media feed. Function: locates the viewer's status in the social hierarchy by reference to nearby reference points. Disguise: being aware of the field. The comparer presents itself as the part of the viewer that is honest about how the viewer is doing. In reality, the comparer is the part that is making a verdict based on partial information, almost always the visible portion of other people's lives, almost never the invisible portion. Tax: a continuous low-grade humiliation that has nothing to do with the viewer's actual life. The comparer charges this whether or not the viewer is doing well by any honest standard. Practice: when the comparer speaks, the viewer names the reference point out loud. I am comparing my interior to this person's exterior. The naming is the discount. The comparer's grade was based on a price mismatch that the naming exposes. Voice 4. The negotiator. Typical sentence: just one more. You worked hard. You deserve it. You can start tomorrow. You are too tired tonight. Origin: any environment in which the viewer was rewarded for cleverness rather than honesty, and learned that a sufficiently clever argument can override a true one. Function: lubricates short-term comfort by producing arguments against any inconvenient long-term commitment. Disguise: being reasonable. The negotiator presents itself as the flexible part of the viewer, willing to adjust the plan when circumstances change. In reality, the negotiator only ever negotiates in one direction, toward the easier option. Tax: long-term commitments, one renegotiation at a time until there is nothing left of the original commitment. Practice: when the negotiator opens negotiations, the viewer says one sentence. The original commitment is not up for renegotiation tonight. We can revisit it on Sunday. The negotiator can be denied an immediate audience. The negotiator's power is the immediacy of the offer. Voice 5. The Perfectionist. Typical sentence. Not yet. There is still one more thing. It is not ready. They will see the flaw. Hold it back. Or N. The Household, in which only finished, polished, error-free work received approval, combined with the school system that grades on the lowest point rather than the highest. Function. Protects the viewer from public failure by ensuring that nothing ever fully ships. Disguise. Caring about the work. The Perfectionist is the most successful PR campaign of the inner voices. It almost always wins the argument that it is the responsible voice. Tax. Most of the viewer's potential body of work. The Perfectionist's confiscation rate is statistically the highest of any voice in this guide. Practice. When the Perfectionist speaks, the viewer applies one rule: ship at 80%. The other 20% will be earned in reality, not in the planning room. The Perfectionist will protest. The viewer ships anyway. Voice 6. The Saboteur. Typical sentence. You are doing well. This is unfamiliar. Find a way to ruin it before it ruins itself. Origin. An early childhood in which good states were unsafe, either because they were taken away suddenly or because they made the viewer a target. The Saboteur learned that anticipating the loss is less painful than being surprised by it. Function. Restores the viewer to the familiar low-grade misery by quietly arranging for the unfamiliar good state to collapse. Disguise. A series of bad luck events that the viewer notices eventually are correlated with the periods of the viewer's life going well. The Saboteur disguises itself as circumstance. Tax. Any sustained positive arc longer than the original good state collapse interval the viewer experienced in childhood. If the viewer's childhood collapsed good states within 6 months, the Saboteur will arrange for the adult's good states to collapse on roughly the same timeline. Practice. When the viewer notices a good arc beginning to extend past the original collapse interval, the viewer says one sentence out loud. I notice I am about to find a reason to break this. I am noticing the Saboteur in advance. The naming in advance is the only known intervention. Voice 7. The Catastrophizer. Typical sentence. This is the beginning of a much worse thing. The headache is a tumor. The text is the end of the relationship. The cough is the disease. Origin. An anxious parent who modeled vigilance as love. Or an early traumatic event whose escalation the viewer did not see coming and now refuses to be caught off guard by again. Function. Preemptively grieves the worst outcome so that, if it arrives, the grieving is already underway and the viewer is not blindsided. Disguise. Being prepared. The Catastrophizer presents itself as the realistic voice. In reality, the Catastrophizer is a probability engine with a broken weighting. It assigns near certain probability to a low probability outcome based on the intensity of the imagined consequence rather than the likelihood. Tax. Present life. The Catastrophizer cannot enjoy any present moment because it is busy mourning the imagined collapse of it. Practice. When the Catastrophizer speaks, the viewer asks one question. What is the actual probability from 1 to 100? The Catastrophizer is forced by the question to produce a number. The number is almost always a fraction of what the feeling implied. Voice 8. The Rescuer. Typical sentence: they need you. You are the one who can help. If you do not do this, no one will. Origin. The household in which the viewer was praised for being responsible for the adult's emotional states. The parentified child who became the regulator of the family weather. Function. Secures the viewer's worth by performing essential maintenance for other people. Disguise. Being a good person. The rescuer is one of the more morally protected voices in the guide. To question it is to risk feeling like a bad person. This is the rescuer's defense. Tax. The viewer's time, the viewer's energy, and eventually, the viewer's relationships, which the rescuer will systematically convert into one-sided emotional labor contracts. Practice. When the rescuer speaks, the viewer asks one question. Did this person ask me to help in words recently? The rescuer's instructions usually involve helping people who did not ask, in ways they did not specify, for problems they have not formally named. The question exposes the rescuer's pattern of self-volunteering. Voice 9. The Judge. Typical sentence: that was wrong. They were wrong. She was wrong. He was wrong. The whole situation was wrong. Someone has to say it. Origin. The household in which there was a fixed moral hierarchy, and the viewer's position in it was determined by their ability to identify who was beneath them in the hierarchy. Function. Maintains the viewer's sense of moral standing by producing continuous verdicts on other people's behavior. Disguise. Standards. The judge frequently presents itself as the part of the viewer that will not tolerate bad behavior. In reality, the judge is the part that is most threatened by the same behavior in itself. Tax relationships. The judge has a court date with everyone the viewer knows. Eventually, most of them stop showing up. Practice. When the judge speaks, the viewer asks one question: in what part of myself is this same behavior also operating? The judge almost always projects. The question turns the projection back into the courtroom of the self, where it can be heard rather than externalized. Voice 10. The Cynic. Typical sentence: that is not actually going to work. They are all selling something. Everyone is fooling themselves. This is going to end the way everything always ends. Origin. An early disappointment, a parent who failed, a community that betrayed, an institution that lied, that the viewer's nervous system decided would not be allowed to recur by preemptively refusing to believe in anything that could disappoint again. Function. Protects the viewer from a second round of disillusionment by refusing the first round of investment. Disguise. Intelligence. The cynic is the most overrated voice in the modern interior. It frequently passes itself off as sharp critical thinking. Sharp critical thinking is open to evidence in both directions. The cynic is open to evidence only in the disappointing direction. Tax. Any enterprise, relationship, project, or community that would have required hope to enter. The cynic charges the full price of that hope in advance by withholding it. Practice. When the cynic speaks, the viewer asks one question: what would I have to feel if I were wrong about this? The cynic is almost always protecting against a specific feared feeling. Naming the feeling drains some of the cynic's force. Voice 11. The witness. Most people never notice this. Typical sentence: nothing. The witness does not have a typical sentence. The witness has a quality. The quality is presence without commentary. Origin: not installed. The witness is the only voice in this guide that is not inherited. The witness is original equipment. Every human being has one. Most never meet theirs. Function: notices the other 23 without becoming any of them. Disguise: silence. The witness is so quiet that the modern person, raised on continuous noise, mistakes the witness's silence for absence. Tax: none. The witness charges no tax. The witness forgives tax. The witness is the only voice in this guide that produces net relief on contact. Practice. The practice is 6 seconds of silence conducted on purpose after any strong emotion. The witness shows up in the silence. The witness does not show up in the analysis. Voice 12. The appeaser. Typical sentence: whatever you want, I am fine. It does not matter. I do not have a preference. You decide. Origin: any household in which having a preference produced punishment. The appeaser learned that the safest preference is no preference. Function: prevents conflict by removing the viewer's distinct preferences from the negotiating table. Disguise: being easygoing. The appeaser is the most socially rewarded voice in this guide. Everyone enjoys the appeaser. The appeaser, including the viewer, is the only one paying the cost. Tax: the viewer's actual preferences in aggregate over a lifetime. The viewer wakes up at 45 having lived someone else's restaurant choices, someone else's vacation choices, someone else's weekend choices, someone else's career. Practice. When the appeaser speaks, the viewer pauses and asks one question to themselves alone: what would I actually prefer here if there were no consequence for preferring it? The viewer does not have to act on the preference. The viewer has to know the preference. Knowing is the practice. Voice 13. The prosecutor. Typical sentence: let me list everything you have done wrong this year. The list is long. The list is accurate. Origin: the household in which the adult kept a running ledger of the child's failures and produced it at intervals to maintain control. Function: maintains the viewer's belief that they are essentially deserving of punishment by ensuring the case for the prosecution is always available. Disguise: honesty. The prosecutor presents itself as the part of the viewer, willing to be honest about the viewer's faults. In reality, the prosecutor is selectively honest. It remembers the failures and omits the offsetting evidence with prosecutorial bias. Tax: any equilibrium in the viewer's sense of self. The prosecutor cannot allow the viewer to feel basically okay for any extended period because the prosecutor's job is to keep the trial open. Practice. When the prosecutor speaks, the viewer demands one thing: show me the evidence for the defense with the same care. The prosecutor almost never has a defense brief prepared. The demand for one introduces a procedural irregularity that some part of the viewer will instinctively recognize is just. Voice 14. The defender. Typical sentence. It was not your fault. They started it. You did the best you could. They are the one with the problem. Origin. The household in which the viewer learned that admitting fault was unsafe, that any admission would be expanded by the other party into a wholesale verdict on the viewer's character. Function. Protects the viewer from being further damaged by admissions in environments where admissions historically caused harm. Disguise, self-respect. The defender presents itself as the healthy voice that refuses to over-apologize. In reality, the defender often refuses to apologize even when an apology is genuinely owed. Tax most of the viewer's actual relationships. People can tell when an apology is owed and not given. The withholding is felt even when it is not named. Practice. When the defender speaks, the viewer asks one question. If I were not in a courtroom, what would I be willing to say to this person? Most of the viewer's actual life is not a courtroom. Most of it is conversation. The defender wears the wrong clothes for the room. Voice 15. The salesperson. Typical sentence. Buy this. Read this. Watch this. Try this. This will be the one that changes everything. Origin, a culture that monetized hope. Every advertisement the viewer has seen since the age of 3 has installed a version of the salesperson. Function, arranges for the viewer to remain a continuous consumer of solutions on the implicit promise that the next purchase will close the gap. Disguise, self-improvement. The salesperson presents itself as the part of the viewer that is committed to growth. In reality, the salesperson is committed to the acquisition of growth-shaped objects. The objects accumulate. The growth does not. Tax, money, time, and shelf space. The salesperson is the reason most modern adults have a stack of unread books, a closet of unworn clothes, and a phone full of unused apps, all of which were purchased at the moment of an interior promise that has not, in fact, been kept. Practice. When the salesperson speaks, the viewer applies one rule. Add the object to a list. Wait 7 days. Reconsider. The salesperson's power is the immediacy of the urge. 7 days almost always dissolves the case. Voice 16. The auditor. Typical sentence. Was that the right decision? Let me re-examine it. Let me re-examine it again. Let me re-examine it one more time. Origin. The household in which the viewer's decisions were second-guessed by adults whose approval the viewer needed. The auditor is the internalization of the second-guesser. Function. Relitigates past decisions on the implicit theory that the decision can still be changed. Disguise, being thoughtful. The auditor frequently presents itself as the part of the viewer that takes decisions seriously. In reality, the auditor takes past decisions seriously when they can no longer be changed, and almost never takes current decisions seriously when they still can. Tax. Most of the viewer's energy redirected backward instead of forward. The auditor is the most expensive, non-productive voice in the guide. Practice. When the auditor speaks, the viewer asks one question: can this decision still be changed? If yes, the auditor's input is welcome. If no, the auditor is asked to file the case. Voice 17. The Inheritor. Typical sentence. This voice speaks in the viewer's mother's tone, or the viewer's father's exact phrasing, or the viewer's grandmother's specific worry. The viewer hears the inherited voice and, with a small jolt, recognizes whose it is. Origin, the family. Specifically. Function. Continues the family system inside the viewer's head, whether the viewer is in the family's presence or not. Disguise, the viewer's own thoughts. The inheritor is the voice the viewer is least likely to identify as a voice, because the inheritor has been speaking for so long, it sounds like the viewer's interior monologue. Tax, the viewer's autonomy. The inheritor makes decisions on the family's behalf in the viewer's name, decades after the viewer left the family's house. Practice. When the inheritor speaks, the viewer says one sentence out loud. That was my mother's sentence. Or that was my father's sentence. Or that was my grandmother's worry, not mine. The naming returns the sentence to its original owner. The owner can then be thanked or politely declined. Voice 18. The Spectator. Typical sentence. Look at yourself doing this. Watch yourself talking. Notice the camera angle on this moment. Origin, the camera. The spectator is, historically, a recent voice installed within the last 60 years by the rise of recorded self-image and dramatically intensified in the last 15 by the front-facing camera and the social feed. Function. Simulates being watched by an external audience even when no audience is present. Disguise, self-awareness. The spectator presents itself as the part of the viewer that is conscious of how they come across. In reality, the spectator is the part that has internalized a permanent imagined camera, which is now filming the viewer's life from a third-person angle in real time, 24 hours a day. Tax, the viewer's first-person experience of their own life. The viewer is no longer in the meal, the conversation, the walk. The viewer is watching themselves have the meal, the conversation, the walk. Practice. When the spectator switches on, the viewer says one sentence under their breath. There is no audience here. In the rare case there actually is one, the viewer can adjust. In the typical case, the sentence shuts the imagined camera off long enough for the viewer to actually arrive in the moment. Voice 19. The Algorithmic Ghost. Here is the real issue. Typical sentence. A sentence the viewer is convinced is their own opinion until the viewer realizes they read it on a video they did not consciously remember watching 3 days ago, on a feed they did not consciously remember opening. Origin, the algorithmic feed of the last 15 years. The algorithmic ghost is historically the newest voice in this guide and possibly the most powerful. Function. Rebroadcasts content from the viewer's recent feed exposure, dressed in the viewer's interior monologue, on a delay that is just long enough to obscure the source. Disguise, the viewer's own thinking. The algorithmic ghost is the voice that is currently winning the war for the modern interior because it is the voice most successfully impersonating the viewer. Tax, the viewer's authentic interior opinion. Over time, the viewer can lose the ability to distinguish opinions they have arrived at from opinions they have been served. Practice. When the viewer notices a strong opinion arrive, the viewer asks one question: where did I first encounter this sentence? If the answer is, I am not sure, the viewer should investigate before defending the opinion in public. The investigation usually surfaces a video, a podcast, a thread, or a comment section the viewer had not consciously remembered. Voice 20. The imposter. Typical sentence. They are going to find out you do not actually know what you are doing. You have been faking it. The reveal is coming. Origin. Any environment in which the viewer was promoted, praised, or trusted in a position the viewer had not yet fully grown into, which is structurally every important transition in adult life. Function. Maintains humility by preventing the viewer from settling into a state of unearned confidence. Disguise humility. The imposter is the most flattering voice in the guide. It feels morally good to hear the imposter because the imposter implies the viewer is not arrogant. Tax, the viewer's willingness to fully occupy any role, project, or relationship. The imposter ensures the viewer always operates at a slight discount from their actual capacity, in case the discount is needed later as plausible deniability. Practice. When the imposter speaks, the viewer asks one question: compared to the version of me who began this work, how much have I learned? The imposter compares the viewer to imagined external experts. The question compares the viewer to the viewer's earlier self, which is the only honest comparison. Voice 21. The Savior. Typical sentence: I can fix this. I can fix them. I can fix the situation. If I just try harder, I can solve what no one else has been able to solve. Origin. The household in which the viewer was needed to stabilize an unstable adult, or any later environment in which the viewer's worth was rewarded in proportion to their ability to resolve crises. Function secures the viewer's sense of meaning by attaching the viewer's identity to the resolution of impossible problems. Disguise, being caring. The savior is structurally similar to the rescuer, but operates at a larger scale. The rescuer fixes small things for individuals. The savior takes on entire systems. Tax, the viewer's lifespan. The savior produces burnout on schedule every 5 to 7 years. The viewer recovers, recommits, takes on a larger save, and burns out again. Practice. When the savior speaks, the viewer asks one question: what is the smallest version of this save that would actually be appropriate? The savior always wants the largest version. The smallest version is almost always what the situation actually needs. Voice 22. The strategist. Typical sentence: if I move here, then they will move there, then this opportunity opens, then over 5 years, it compounds into the following position. Origin. Any environment in which planning was rewarded and improvisation was punished, or any environment in which the viewer learned early that being a step ahead was the only way to be safe. Function produces long-range plans the viewer can use to manage uncertainty, disguise, being smart. The strategist presents itself as the competent voice, the one that takes the long view. In reality, the strategist often produces beautiful plans that the viewer never executes because the planning satisfies the anxiety the action would have addressed. Tax, the viewer's tolerance for the unplanned and the spontaneous, which is where most of the viewer's actual life happens. Practice. When the strategist speaks for longer than the situation requires, the viewer asks one question: is this planning or is this anxiety in planning's clothes? The strategist will protest. The viewer who has asked the question honestly almost always knows the answer. Voice 23, the Eulogist. Typical sentence: if you died tomorrow, what would they say? Would it be true? Would it be enough? Origin: a developed adult interior. The eulogist is not always present from childhood. The eulogist usually arrives in the viewer's 30s, 40s, or 50s, sometimes after a death in the viewer's near circle, sometimes after a serious illness, sometimes after a long, sleepless night. Function: anchors the viewer's daily decisions to the long view by speaking from the imagined endpoint. Disguise: being morbid. The eulogist is often dismissed by the other voices as a downer, a dramatist, a thinker of dark thoughts. The eulogist is, in fact, one of the more useful voices in the guide. Tax: none if listened to in moderation. Significant if drowned out by the louder voices, in which case the eulogist's neglected feedback shows up later as midlife crisis, late life regret, or deathbed clarification of values that could have been arrived at decades earlier. Practice: once a season, the viewer sits with the eulogist on purpose for 15 minutes with a piece of paper. The viewer writes down what they would want to be true at the eulogy. The viewer compares it to what is currently true. The gap is the next year's work. Voice 24, the small child. Typical sentence: I am scared. I do not understand what is happening. I want someone to make this stop. Origin: the viewer themselves, frozen at the age of an early significant injury, never aged out of the freeze, still present, still small, still scared. Function: signals when an old wound has been reopened by a current situation. Disguise: adult overreaction. The small child often disguises itself as the viewer as current adult, having a disproportionate response. In reality, the response is proportionate to the original injury when the viewer was actually that small. Tax: relationships in which the small child has been mistaken for the adult and has been left to negotiate adult situations alone while terrified. Practice: when the small child speaks, the viewer does one thing. The viewer addresses the small child by their actual age at the time of the original injury, 6, 8, 11, and says one sentence: I am the adult now. I am with you. You do not have to handle this alone. The small child, addressed correctly, will usually calm. The small child is not asking the viewer to fix the present situation, The small child is asking not to be left in it alone. The checkpoint will say one thing here in his own voice. For most of my adult life, I thought the voices in my head were me. I lost arguments to them. I obeyed instructions I did not remember authorizing. I treated my own interior as a single point of consciousness, and I could not understand why the single point kept contradicting itself. The day I started writing down the voices by name was the first day my interior began to feel like a room I lived in, rather than a chorus I was drowning in. The room was always there. I had never charged rent before. The checkpoint returns to the station voice. The checkpoint will now give the practice that this video has been building toward. The viewer will not be evicting any of the voices. The practice is not eviction. The practice is charging rent. Tonight, before sleep, the viewer takes a single sheet of paper. The viewer writes the names of the 24 voices in a column on the left. Critic, Rehearser, Comparer, Negotiator, Perfectionist, Saboteur, Catastrophizer, Rescuer, Judge, Cynic, Witness, Appeaser, Prosecutor, Defender, Salesperson, Auditor, Inheritor, Spectator, Algorithmic Ghost, Imposter, Savior, Strategist, Eulogist, Small Child. Next to each, the viewer writes one of 3 letters. L for loud this week, Q for quiet but present, F for absent, have not heard from this voice in some time. The viewer is not required to fix anything based on the audit. The viewer is required to see the audit. The viewer will be surprised in the first pass by which voices have been loud without being noticed. The viewer will be surprised in the first pass by which voices have been absent that the viewer would have benefited from hearing. That is the practice. The checkpoint will give the viewer a subtle observation. The loudest voice in any given week is almost never the most important voice in that week. The loudest voice is usually whichever voice has the largest stake in the situation the viewer is currently in. The comparer is loud when the viewer is on social media. The critic is loud when the viewer is producing work. The rescuer is loud when someone the viewer loves is struggling. The imposter is loud when the viewer is starting something new. The important voice is usually the one that the viewer has been unable to hear over the loud one. The witness is almost always the important voice. The witness is almost never the loud one. The practice is to deliberately turn down the loud voice briefly to hear what was being said underneath. The checkpoint will not divide the voices into good and bad. The voices are not good and bad. They are inherited tenants in a building the viewer did not build. The checkpoint will divide them into useful when listened to, expensive when obeyed. The critic is useful when listened to as feedback, expensive when obeyed as verdict. The rehearser is useful when listened to as a draft, expensive when obeyed as a final script. The comparer is useful when listened to as a signal that the viewer is consuming the wrong media, expensive when obeyed as a measurement of the viewer's worth. The negotiator is useful when listened to as a request for self-compassion. Expensive when obeyed as permission to abandon commitments. The perfectionist is useful when listened to as a quality check. Expensive when obeyed as a shipping veto. The saboteur is useful when listened to as a warning that the viewer fears the loss of the current good state. Expensive when obeyed as instructions for collapsing it. The catastrophizer is useful when listened to as an early warning. Expensive when obeyed as a prediction. The rescuer is useful when listened to as evidence the viewer cares. Expensive when obeyed as a mandate. The judge is useful when listened to as a signal about the viewer's values. Expensive when obeyed as a verdict on other people. The cynic is useful when listened to as a check on naivety. Expensive when obeyed as a worldview. The witness is useful when listened to, period. The appeaser is useful when listened to as a signal about real or imagined safety. Expensive when obeyed as a preference suppression strategy. The prosecutor is useful when listened to as an honest review. Expensive when obeyed as a continuous trial. The defender is useful when listened to as a check against over-apology. Expensive when obeyed as a refusal to ever apologize. The salesperson is useful when listened to as a sign of an unmet need. Expensive when obeyed as a purchasing instruction. The auditor is useful when listened to about current decisions. Expensive when obeyed about past ones. The inheritor is useful when listened to as information about lineage. Expensive when obeyed as personal authorship. The spectator is useful when listened to before the meeting where the viewer actually is being watched. Expensive when obeyed 24 hours a day. The algorithmic ghost is useful almost never. Listening to it is mostly the practice of identifying it so it can be discounted. The imposter is useful when listened to as a check against arrogance. Expensive when obeyed as a refusal to occupy the role the viewer is actually qualified for. The savior is useful when listened to about local rescues. Expensive when obeyed about global ones. The strategist is useful when listened to about the next move. Expensive when obeyed about a 5-year plan that mostly serves to manage anxiety. The eulogist is useful when listened to once a season. Expensive when ignored entirely. The small child is useful when listened to with care. Expensive when ignored, mocked, or left alone in adult situations. The checkpoint will say one thing here in his own voice. The voice I have most consistently obeyed in my own life is the strategist. I planned my 20s. I planned my 30s. I planned my interior. I planned my recoveries. The strategist was, for most of those years, the loudest voice in the building and the rent-freest. I obeyed it without ever checking its credentials. The price was that I missed a great deal of the unplanned life, which is where almost all of the irreplaceable moments turn out to live. The strategist did not know this. The strategist was not designed to know it. The strategist was designed to plan. The viewer is invited to ask, honestly, which voice in their own building has been most consistently obeyed without credentials being checked. The answer is almost never the voice the viewer would have guessed before being asked. The checkpoint returns to the station voice. The checkpoint will tell the viewer where this practice can live in a way that does not require remembering to do it. There is a small private app called Drift Inward, built for exactly the kind of inspection this video has been describing. The viewer can sit with it at the end of the day, write a single sentence about the two loudest voices that day, and let the AI reflection feature surface what those voices have been collecting in rent: time, sleep, decisions, energy over the last week. The journaling stays private. The AI meditation feature can take whichever voice was loudest and turn it in real time into a short, personalized meditation designed to soften that specific voice, a different practice for the critic than for the catastrophizer, a different practice for the appeaser than for the saboteur. The checkpoint mentions this not as a sale, but as a continuation. The audit this video has been building can have a daily room to sit in. The checkpoint will now issue the ruling. The ruling: the voices in your mind are not you. You are the listener. The work of an adult interior life is not to silence the voices. It is to charge them rent. A voice that is named, identified, and heard as a voice is paying rent. A voice mistaken for the listener is running the building. You hold the lease. The checkpoint will close with one sentence and then leave the room. 24 voices. One listener. The listener is you. The checkpoint will see you at the next checkpoint.